I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Today, I'm releasing 4 brand new episodes of Parallax Views back to back as part of a special fundraising push to keep the show going strong. Each episode represents the kind of deep dive, thought-provoking content you've come to expect from the program. This mega drop isn't just a content dump, it's a statement. Independent media matters, and your support makes it possible. If Parallax Views has challenged your thinking, exposed you to new ideas, or simply kept you company on your commute, now's the time to help sustain it. Listen, share, and if you can, support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you want, you can also make a one-time donation by contacting me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. I can give you a link to my PayPal page if you contact me that way. Let's show what listener-supported media can do. With that out of the way, on this edition of the program, we'll be hearing from returning guest Dr. Jack Rasmus, political economist and author of such books as The Scourge of Neoliberalism and the upcoming Twilight of American Imperialism. In this conversation, Dr. Rasmus and I will dissect Trump's Big Beautiful Bill, which just passed in the Senate. Additionally, we'll also be discussing how Trump is seeking to restructure U.S. foreign policy and what that entails. All that and much more in the conversation to follow with Dr. Jack Rasmus. With that being said, let's get right to it. Welcome back to Parallax Views, a guest that I always enjoy having on, Dr. Jack Rasmus, who has a new book coming out soon, I believe, Twilight of American Imperialism. That'll be out from Clarity Press, and we're going to be talking about the American Empire, the recent war with Iran, Israel, and the U.S., and I assume we'll talk about Trump's Big Beautiful Bill. How are you doing, Jack Rasmus?
Fine, thank
So
you.
where do you think we should start? Should we start with foreign policy or the Big Beautiful Bill?
Wherever you want, just jump in and we can talk
Well, let's
about
start
the
with
beautiful
that if we
bills
can. I mean,
if you want.
what's your analysis of this?
All right, okay. Yeah. Well, this is all part of a long-term meaning since 2001 of tax cuts, mostly targeting businesses, corporations, and non-corporate businesses and wealthy investors. The U.S. has cut taxes since 2001, about $17 trillion in tax cuts, 17 trillion, which is an awful lot. In 2017-18, we had the Trump tax cuts, which was $4.5 trillion of that. Now, at the time, you had the media and mainstream economists, like Robert Reich and Paul Krugman was saying, and the media, New York Times, saying, it was only $1.5 trillion. Well, my articles and analysis was it was $4.5 trillion, not $1.5 trillion, because two things. One, they didn't calculate the full offshore U.S. corporate tax cuts. They did include a lot of that. And also, they assumed that the U.S. Economy would grow at 3.5% GDP for the next 10 years every year. Of course, we know 2020 it crashed. And ever since then, it's been anemic GDP growth. So all that offset from supposedly tax cuts boosting investment and spending never happened. And confirmation that the Trump tax cut was 4.5 trillion was the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, the research arm of Congress, which in the course of the current negotiations on tax cuts has said that that Trump tax cut in 2017 was really $4 trillion. So I've been right all along. And the media, of course, were obfuscating it. And of course, the Democrats were doing the same as the Republicans, not reporting the full impact of the tax cuts because the Democrats liked the tax cuts. I'm talking about Democrat leadership. They never really tried to roll back the Trump tax cuts in 2017. They talked about it, but they never made any realistic effort to do that because the Democratic Party, you got to understand, is controlled by big money bags now, more than ever before, particularly since Citizens United. So there is much in favor of the big tax cuts, which have benefited corporations, wealthy investors, and to some extent small businesses. Now, the 2017 tax cuts, about 1.5 trillion or more of that 4.5 trillion, really benefited corporations. And when they passed that in 2017, they made those tax cuts permanent. What wasn't permanent was the small business tax cuts, the pass-through and individual, and some of the other consumer tax cuts. And that's what's up now for renewal. You see, they had them expire after 5 years. But you got to understand, the corporate tax cuts, almost 2 trillion, are not up for renewal. And you cannot cut those, right? And that's, they protected the big corporations. So you got to think about this tax cut going through as now it's the time for small businesses and smaller investors to get their bite of the apple because those tax cuts in 2017 were expiring now. The main small business tax cut for proprietors and partnerships is called the pass-through. In other words, for 23% now, the House raised it, of costs. They can just take revenue, rather. Businesses, small unincorporated businesses, can just take 23% right off the top and not pay taxes on it. You see, that's the nature of that pass through. And then individual tax cuts are there as well. So now it's the time of making the pass through small business and individual smaller medium investors their bite of the apple. That's the core of what's going on now. Now, what Trump also threw into the pot here on this tax cut is some cuts for the working class. He's got in his election, he's got a segment of the working class voting for him, and he's trying to solidify that. And 600 billion of the current 4 trillion, that's the estimate for the current tax cuts, 4 trillion. However, I don't think that includes the 1.5 trillion for that's permanent, that just continues. You see, you've got to count that. That's a continuing tax cut. But they don't like to talk about the continuation. They just talk about the new tax cuts. That's $4 trillion, right? And right now, there's some 600 billion of that is working class tax cuts. The big part of that, of course, is the small business pass through and individual tax cuts, which are both going to be made permanent now. So we got the 600 billion of a working class tax. That's the no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, raising the standard deduction for Social Security. Originally, he proposed to eliminate Social Security taxing the Social Security income. We're not talking about the payroll tax. It's the income tax that you pay on Social Security benefits that you get. So, average workers and, middle-class people who collect Social Security are taxed twice. They're taxed on payroll, and then they're taxed on the income when they start collecting it. By the way, that tax was not part of original Social Security. That was passed by Reagan in the 80s. 50% of your income, unless you're very poor, gets taxed. Your Social Security income, benefits. Clinton raised that to 85%. Right. So both of them have been taxing Social Security income. Trump ran on, I'm going to get rid of it. No, he's not. He just raises the deduction, standard deduction. You get another, instead of I think 30%, you get 40% or something like that. Okay. So you got those three, actually four tax cuts for the working class, which is the tips, the overtime, Social Security deduction, and no tax or tax deduction on interest if you buy a new issue made car. So those four amount to 600 billion. That's part of this $4 trillion package. Remember, the 4 trillion doesn't count the 1.5, 2 trillion already for corporations. So this thing is about $6 trillion if you count the continuation. 6 trillion, more than the 4 trillion that they're saying. They're still de-emphasizing the true cost of this bill, just as they did in 2017-18. They play in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the mainstream media goes along with the whole thing. And the mainstream economists, they go along with the whole thing because they write columns, for those papers. So this thing is much bigger than they're saying, but it amounts to a continuation of the 17 trillion up to now of tax cuts that have occurred, 80% of which go to capitalists, either corporate taxes or business taxes or individual investment taxes. There are no increases in taxes of any kind, from what I can tell in this bill. We haven't seen all the details yet. We will next couple of days. No increases. They could raise taxes and recoup that revenue any way they want. But what they're doing is cutting spending. The target for Congress is to cut like $1.7 trillion in programs, mostly Medicare, SNAP, education, energy tax credits. They want to get rid of that because they don't believe in global warming, whatever. So about 1.7 trillion on top of the 4 trillion, right, of actual tax cuts, about 1.7 trillion. There's also about $1 trillion increase in Pentagon and Homeland Security and ICE and so forth. So what you got is the increase in spending for the Pentagon, $1 trillion. You got 1.7 trillion social program cuts, and you got about 4 trillion in new tax cuts, mostly for small businesses and individuals and so forth. That's what the bill is, but it's a continuation of this fiscal policy, which is the neoliberal policy ever since Reagan. You cut taxes on the rich, you cut taxes on corporations, you cut taxes on small capitalists, right? At the same time, you try to pay for it in part by cutting social programs. But the cuts to social programs don't even come close to amounting the loss in revenue to the government from the tax cuts. So you get deficits building up ever since 2000. And the cumulative deficits every year amount to the increase in the national debt. So we've got these rising deficits every year, and for the last 5 years, it's been running about $2 trillion a year. In other words, they're adding $2 trillion a year to the national debt. This year, it's going to be $2 trillion again, even with these cuts. Okay, and it's probably going to continue to go up. So $2 trillion a year is a huge amount added to the national debt, which is close to 37 trillion now. Right? In 2000, the national debt was $5.5 trillion. You cut taxes by 17 plus trillion. You spend 9 to 10 trillion over the same period on wars and Pentagon increases, right? There's 26 of the 37 trillion. Then you have these bailouts, $1 trillion in 2008-9. In 2021-22, it rises to 5 to 6 trillion, the bailout. Huge, right? $3.1 trillion crisis spending, social spending. They had to spend on social programs, right? 3.1 trillion in 2020, another 1.9 trillion in 21 under Biden, and another 1.7 trillion in subsidies for investment in 2022. So what? That's $6.7 trillion in bailouts. And you got to understand the cuts to social programs now are an attempt to take back some of that. I mean, the big cuts in Medicare and SNAP and so forth are really cuts of what was increased in those programs in 2021. Right? They always take back what is austerity once the crisis is over. That happened with Obama. You know, Obama in 2009 spent $787 billion, fiscal tax cuts and spending stimulus to get through the crisis. And then in 2011, he agrees with the Republicans to cut another $1 trillion. So he gives $787 billion and he takes $1 trillion back, right? So the Democrats do it, but now the spending was even bigger in 2021. The amount they're taking back is about 1.5, 1.7 trillion.
So you spend and then you go to austerity, then you spend, yeah.
Yeah, when there's a social crisis and, a crash in the economy. Now, the crash in the economy and those bailouts, right, are in addition to hitting the deficit debt, are in addition to the massive increase in war spending, 9-10 trillion over the last quarter century, right? And the massive tax cuts, mostly going to corporations and the rich, 17 trillion. 17 trillion, 9 trillion in more spending, 26 trillion. You spend another 6 to 7 trillion in bailouts, that's 34 trillion. The rest is the increase in interest on the debt. So those four reasons, you see, are what's going on and why there's a fiscal crisis in the capitalist state brewing. And they know it. They know it, and they're trying to address it, but they can't get off of this throwing money in tax cuts at the rich or throwing money to protect the empire for defense and war spending. You see, they're addicted to those two things, but those two things are the main cause of this huge increase in annual deficits and the debt. Now, there's another factor here, and that's interest payments on the debt. Now, those interest payments were relatively low until the Fed started raising interest rates. Now the interest rates are 4 or 5%, and the interest payments on the debt to bondholders now is $1 trillion a year. It's $1 trillion a year added to the annual deficit and debt. Okay, huge amount, a huge amount by the Federal Reserve. That's the body, that the government agency that sells bonds, right? It sells bonds in order to make up the gap in tax revenue that's being cut, right? And spending that's rising. That's the deficit. That's what's 2 trillion a year, adding up to national debt. You have to get money somewhere to pay for that $2 trillion in tax cuts and spending programs, right? You do that by selling bonds. The federal government, the Federal Reserve, central bank sells bonds. It has to pay the bondholders interest. That's where that $1 trillion now, other factor comes in, adding to the war spending, the tax cutting, the interest on the debt, and the price gouging by the private healthcare industries, raising government programs, the cost of programs, ACA, Obamacare, SHIP, whatever, right? That's the reason we have this huge deficit and debt right now. And that's producing a fiscal crisis because.
So you're saying that the war spending and these other factors are exacerbating okay.
Exacerbating, yes. Right. And it's pretty much 21st century stuff. The debt, the national debt was, as I said, 5.5 trillion in 2000. Now it's 37 trillion, and over that period, the 17 trillion in tax cuts and the 9 trillion in wars and the two big bailouts and the price gouging by monopoly healthcare and pharma companies. That's it, right? But they don't address any of that. They don't want to, because the empire, right, needs the funding. They got to spend on the Pentagon. They got to spend on all the other defense. The Pentagon bill is $1 trillion a year now, rising under this bill. But we're really spending about $1.4 trillion on defense, because the Pentagon is only part of the defense spending. The Pentagon and its war spending, right? It's only part of the defense. You've got spending on Energy, the military, U.S. military is the biggest consumer of fossil fuels in the world, right? Where does that fuel spending comes from? It's not in the Pentagon. It's in the Energy Department, right? What about veterans? Huge costs. I mean, that's past wars, and veterans benefits going up significantly. Atomic Energy Commission, that's not there in the Pentagon spending, right? That's where they develop new nuclear arms, right? Homeland Security, we're spending what, 50, 70 billion a year in Homeland Security. That's going up because of the border spending, right? The CIA is part of that, right? The NSA, the DNI, and all the other,
Alphabet agencies, yeah.
All of that. They have their private armies, they have their mercenaries, all that's part of the defense spending that's in those other budgets, justice and so forth. When you put all that together, we're spending $1.4 trillion, $1.4 trillion on defense every year. We're spending $1 trillion on interest on the debt now every year. And by the way, 35% of those payments, interest payments on borrowing, goes to foreigners, foreign banks, foreign corporations, foreign governments, right? 35% of that. So, you've got this fiscal crisis. They don't know how to handle it. Some of the elite of the capitalist class are warning, this thing's unsustainable, which it is in the long run. They don't know where it's going to break, but they can't go on. According to Congressional Budget Office, if we continue at this pace by 2034, 10 years from now, the national debt will be 56 trillion. And the interest payments to bondholders will be 1.7 trillion a year. You see? So it's a fiscal train wreck that's occurring. And it's occurring because we've got this phenomenon that's never happened in US history, and that is 25 years of forever wars and war spending and defense spending, 25 years, and at the same time, massive tax cutting. When the U.S. has gone to war in the past, we've always raised taxes on the rich and everybody else, right?
But since Reagan, we've been lowering the tax. Yeah.
Well, yes, we've been lower, but it's really accelerated since 2000. Okay, this is where the big run-up goes. You go from Reagan, the national debt was less than $1 trillion when Reagan came in. Over the next 20 years, Reagan and Clinton, it rises to the $5.5 trillion in 2000. So in 20 years, you go from 1 trillion to 5.5 trillion, or 4 trillion increase in national debt. But since 2000 to today, you go from 5 trillion to 37 trillion. So $32 trillion. 4 trillion in 20 years, $32 trillion in the next 20 or so years. Okay, it's accelerating. It's accelerating because the cost of empire are accelerating. You see, and that's where you got to see what Trump originally started to do, but I think is going to be defeated, and that is to restructure the empire. The empire is unaffordable, increasingly unaffordable as it's structured. They're trying to reduce the cost of empire, move the spending that they consider wasteful on NGOs, USAID, on NATO, and on these other places in the world, which are not strategic anymore, and move that savings on spending into new weapons and the Pacific, you see, and also to shore up the Western Hemisphere. That's what Trump's all this talk about the Arctic, and Greenland is about, and what taking back Panama is all about. That's consolidating the empire to the Western Hemisphere, you see, taking care of the home base, which they've been ignoring, moving the money from NATO to prepare for conflict with China, and also to develop new weapons systems, which the U.S. is behind on compared to China and Russia. Drones, hypersonic missiles, etc. It's behind. And it needs to accelerate that development. Right? So this is where this fiscal crisis of the state fits into the empire and the growing crisis of the empire. It's such as an affordability crisis. They can't afford it the way it's structured. So they got to structure it. Right? And that's what, you could see some of the elements of Trump when he comes into office trying to do that. But there's a significant segment of the capitalist class and the elite, the neocons, right, who don't want to change what's been going on. They don't want to restructure. They think they can just keep going the way it is. So you got the split in the capitalist class and their political elite on what to do right now, to continue the war in Ukraine, continue the attempt to conquer the Middle East using the proxy of Israel, right? Continue to prepare for the war in China, right? This is what the neocons want. But
And on the other hand, you sort of have the hunker down Fortress America types, or
yeah, they're, let's return to isolationism of sorts, it's not isolationism. It's really about the strategy, how the empire maintains itself. It's not isolationism. That's fake. That's false. There's no elites that want to return to isolationism in the U.S. political elites. The political operatives of the capitalist class, because it's the capitalist class behind all this, I believe. Right? They're the ones who propose these policies, but they're uncertain. They're split as to where to throw all your future resources. Some say we got to make the shift, and they've been saying this since Obama. And others say, no, we can do it all. Like Joe Biden said, what do you mean the USA can fight on three fronts? We're the USA, we can fight in Ukraine and against Russia. We can fight in the Middle East. We can fight in China. He's just a demented old fool, that guy. He always was an empty suit, right? You do whatever they tell them, because you just look at the numbers. They can't. The US empire cannot fight on three fronts.
It's overstretched.
It can't do it Yeah, it's way overstretched fiscally, and you're beginning to see the evidence of that in this fiscal crisis.
So in terms of the big beautiful bill and what it means for what does this mean for working class and middle class Americans?
Well, what it means is there's $600 billion in tax cuts for working class. That's tips, overtime, retired working class, Social Security deduction increase, a deduction of taxation if you buy a new car made in America, right? A new U.S. sold car. That's $600 billion. That's part of trying to, the element, part of the Trump administration wants to tie the working class to bring it back to the Republicans, which is working to some extent. We saw it in the last vote, because the Democrats are totally controlled now by big corporate interests. This is not the Democrat Party of your grandpa, right? No, this is some Citizens United. This is big money. They've taken over the Democrat National Committee. They don't want tax cuts. And the Democrats' political strategy, electoral political strategy, was let's not talk about traditional Democrat issues, pocketbook issues, economic issues. Let's not talk about that anymore. Let's talk about identity politics and woke, right? They've replaced those traditional issues that they just pay, lip service to with all this wokeism and this identity politics, and it backfired on them, particularly in the elections. The Republicans just tore them apart on that issue, and they had nothing really to say about what are they going to do for the working class, which has been slowly choking since 2007. You see,
They didn't focus on the bread and butter, in other words.
Yeah, the traditional economic. They wouldn't even support no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on Social Security. The Democrats created Social Security, right? But they increased under Clinton the taxation of Social Security income. Right? They could say, "Oh well, no, let's eliminated that because it was created by a Republican, by taxing on Social Security income by Reagan." Right? They could have and should have tried to keep the traditional Social Security recipient voters on their side, but they didn't say anything about it. Biden didn't say anything about it. Harris didn't say anything about it. They didn't say anything about issues that appeal to the working class, which is, pocketbook issues. They kept pushing this woke bullshit and, identity politics bullshit, and it's backfired on them. And now they are in total disarray. That party may collapse here. We'll see what happens in the midterms if they can come back. But so far, you got the same old leaders, right? You got the same old policies going on in that party because the Democrat National Committee is controlled by corporate money bags now. They don't want to go to the economic issues, and they're trying and struggling to find some new leadership with a new message, but they have no new message except, oh, Trump is bad. Policies are bad, right? So they're really in a near collapse state. It remains to be seen whether Democrats can recover, I think. I'm not so sure. Let's look at what happens in 2026 and 2028, and we'll have a better picture there. But right now, they're floundering. They got no leadership. No one's out there. I mean, they still got Schumer. They still got all the old hacks going around, Sanders and AOC have to go out and try to spread the message, right? So they're really on the back foot. They're really on the defensive, but they set it up themselves. You see, they set it up themselves, and they manipulated their primaries to get Biden in there twice, and then they threw him out, and then they put Harris in there, which is also an empty suit. So they've shot themselves at both feet. But to your original point, Trump and the Republicans see an opportunity to try to swing some working class votes permanently to their side, and that's what these measures, these 600 billion measures, are really about. But keep in mind that it's very clever, the Republicans. The tips benefit small businesses as well as the workers, you see, because you can just see what hotel and restaurants are going to say to their workers. They're going to say, hey, look, you got this big boost in income from not having to pay taxes on tips. You don't need a wage increase. The government gave you the wage increase that we were going to give you. That's what they're going to do about the tips. And same with overtime pay. Remember, overtime income gets taxed both by businesses and workers. You pay both. Both pay tax on overtime. So if you eliminate tax on overtime, you're eliminated on business taxing on overtime, as well as the working class, right? It cuts both ways. The businesses are benefiting from that. That's why he chose overtime and tips, I think.
Now, what do you think about what this means for things like Medicare and whatnot?
Okay, well, Medicare, as I said earlier, the attack on Medicare is really an attack on Medicaid, right? But Medicaid is tied into Medicare in that one of the measures passed during the COVID bailouts was that if you are low income and you're retired and you're getting Medicare, and most of the low income people claim Medicare at 62 because they're low income. It's a way of getting some income. If you are low income getting Medicare, your monthly Medicare, I would say bill, but your fee, $185 a month you pay for Medicare, gets covered by Medicaid, you see. So and they tied Medicare and Medicaid at the same time. So if you cut Medicaid, you're really cutting Medicare as well to some extent. And there's some other measures in there too. So it's really cutting Medicaid, cutting SNAP, and cutting education. All this talk about getting rid of the education bill is really the federal government dumping education spending on the states and let them do the cutting and the layoffs. Say.
Well, what do you think the impacts of those cuts will be, generally speaking?
Well, I think it's going to really cut working class workers' spending, no doubt. You're taking $1 trillion or more, trillion and a half out of the economy. Now that's over 10 years. So you're taking a couple hundred billion a year out of the economy spending. And, you got to understand in economics, spending has a multiplier effect, right? You spend it once, the next party who gets it spends it again. And it's that multiple impact which has the positive effect on GDP. Well, the multiplier is higher for spending, especially spending by lower income. It's at least a full 2.5%. So 150 billion a year, let's say, and cuts to these medical programs and education, 200 billion total a year, is really 400 billion, maybe, or 450 billion taken out of GDP. So the impact on the economy is going to be significant. Now, the Republicans argue, well, we're cutting taxes, which is going to offset those spending cuts and stimulate the economy, right? Except in economic theory and practice, not just theory, the multiplier effect from a tax cut is much less than the multiplier effect from a spending cut. So you're cutting spending, impacting the economy more than you're stimulating the economy from tax cuts. Now, you also got to distinguish between tax cuts hitting the working class and tax cuts hitting businesses. The tax cuts hitting businesses are even a lower multiplier than tax cuts for consumers and the working class, you see. So you have very low impact from the tax cuts on GDP, which is contrary to all the political hype. Oh, cut tax cuts, it's going to boost GDP. Nonsense. The 4.5 trillion hardly boosted GDP at all back in 2018 and 19. Very little effect on GDP, and then it collapsed in 2020, right? Why is that? Why do business tax cuts to corporations not stimulate GDP the way they used to 30, 40, 50 years ago? Well, the reason is the economy has become financialized, which means a lot of the tax cuts don't go into investment that boosts jobs and income and suppliers and so forth that hits GDP. A lot of the tax cuts for investors and corporations go into financial asset markets, which have no effect whatsoever on real economic growth or real income. They go into stocks and bonds and derivatives and foreign exchange and so forth. Some of that stimulus goes offshore, which doesn't affect the real economy. You see, in the last 50, especially 25 years, we've become financialized, and a lot of production is moved offshore. That stimulus, tax cuts, either go offshore or go into financial markets, and very little now goes into the real economy, which reduces the multiplier even further. So all these tax cuts are hardly going to boost the economy and income, but the spending cuts, particularly on the poor, are going to really dampen spending and the economy. We're moving into a recession, no doubt.
In terms of just two more questions here, and I know we didn't really get to talk about Iran, but I wanted to ask you about uh, what's what is your sort of feeling on Trump, or what are your criticisms of Trump? Because I think they would differ a lot from, some of the like mainstream Democrat talking points we hear.
Like criticism of
With
Trump with
regards
regard to
to
what policy?
both his domestic and foreign policy.
Well, okay, let's start with foreign policy. I mean, Trump, the Republicans, like the Democrats, are totally controlled here in terms of policy by the Zionists, right? Whether you're talking about foreign Zionists, the Israelis, or their domestic rich buddies, right? They get whatever they want. Netanyahu knows that. He can get whatever he wants out of the U.S. government. Why? Because of Citizens United and spending. The Arab, American Israeli Political Action Committee spends hundreds of millions of dollars every election cycle, just on elections. And if you don't support Israeli policies, Zionist policies, well, then you get primaried. They spend money on your primary and they get rid of you. And, the Zionists are deeply embedded in the deep state, in the bureaucracy as well. So there's a stranglehold on the US government here. And that's one explanation why the U.S. does whatever Israel wants or needs. There's an advantage to the U.S. too, because the U.S. uses Israel as the proxy for controlling the Middle East or trying to dominate the Middle East. I mean, think of Israel as the U.S.'s landlocked aircraft carrier. That's what you should think, right?
I was going to ask you about that. How do you thread that needle? Because I think sometimes people can almost go too deep into like, well, Israel just controls everything, and they lose sight of the fact that, the empire also uses Israel.
Exactly. It's a mutual, admiration society here, right? Both cuts both ways, right? And of course, it cuts both ways. U.S. gives Israel all kind of aid, and AIPAC and Israel and American Zionists pay for the congressmen in their elections. Right? How much aid has the U.S. given Israel, by the way? Well, there are studies that say $340 billion since the 1960s. Since the Camp David Accord with Jimmy Carter, they get $3 billion a year off the top. U.S. writes a check, not counting all the other military and other kinds of aids and so forth that occurs. $3 billion, and I think the Egyptians get $1 billion, right? That's been, $4 billion, $4 or $5 billion a year ever since '79, right? But there's other forms and ways that the U.S. gives aid. I mean, like all the ammunition and so forth the U.S. has given Israel since the war started here, the latest one on October 23. I mean, that's a blank check. I think last year Biden, it was like, I don't know, 17-20 billion dollars. Who knows what it is now? So, the U.S. gives Israel, and Israel, wants regime change in Iran. That's the number one issue. I believe all this talk about nuclear development, that's an issue, that's an objective too. But I think it's secondary to regime change, because the Israelis know you can't prevent Iran from developing the bomb by bombing Iran. The only way you can do it is by regime change in Iran. And very clearly, the Israeli policy is regime change. And I think that's ultimately Trump's policy too, regime change, right? These B-2 bombers, very clearly, they know that these B-2 weapons, these bombs could not penetrate 100 meters underground, even if it were flat, right? These are mountainous, right? So their explanation is, we sealed the entrances. Well, the U.S. must have known, as it's come out now, that the Iranians removed all their fissionable nuclear material before the bombing. The U.S. can see what's going on. They know this stuff was removed, but they bombed these sites anyway. Maybe set back the Iranian nuclear development program 6 months, but now they've confirmed it's for sure Iran's going to build a bomb. The whole objective of stopping that has totally failed. So the Israel policy of war, get the U.S. into war with Iran and help them achieve regime change has totally failed. It's come out now that they assassinated a whole number of Iranian military people, and they tried to assassinate Khomeini as well, but they failed. Right? That's regime change. That's regime change. That's the policy of Israel, and Trump supports it, but it's failed. It's failed now. This war is not over. It's just like a Sitzkrieg going on, like 1940 in Europe. It's going to erupt again. And they've not only thrown Iran into totally committed to build a bomb now. I mean, they've thrown out the IAEA inspectors, and they're eliminating everything. And they've signed defense deals with Russia and probably China as well. China and Russia will never let Iran go. They will never let regime change occur in Iran. And they more or less even said so, right? So they've only worsened. The Israelis think that, you can just attack military and bomb the shit out of whoever you want, and that's going to get you where you want. No, it gets you into a deeper hole, is where it's got you.
Do you, out of curiosity, do you think Trump recognizes that potentially? Because I thought it was interesting. He got very mad at Israel during that what he was calling a ceasefire, where he said, they there was a 12-hour grace period and they dropped everything on the Iranians. These countries don't know what they're doing. I think he dropped an F-bomb famously and said they've been fighting so long and so hard, they don't know what the F they're doing. And he was like very angry with Israel, it sounded like. Or am I reading too much into that?
No, I think he was in some sense because it's becoming increasingly costly for the United States. You see, to bail out and sustain Israel. I mean, Israel pretty much almost ran through its anti-missiles inventory, and the U.S. now is going to have to replenish that. It's going to have to spend more militarily to restore Israel's military capacity. So the costs are going up, right? And it's not strategic to the U.S. to have the whole Middle East at war. You see, it's, the U.S. wants relationships with Saudi Arabia and the others because, it's an important energy center in the world. Trump likes the MBS and the Saudis. He wants more deals with them. But if the Israelis keep pushing for more conflict and more war, well, then it's going to screw up the U.S. relationships elsewhere. And it's going to become even more costly to the U.S. to keep, Israel afloat at a time when the U.S. is trying to restructure its empire and reduce the costs, you see. It's not strategic for the U.S. to set the whole Middle East aflame, right? And spend even more money, just as it's not strategic for the U.S. To spend more money on NATO and Ukraine and attacking Russia.
So what you're saying is there's this element of the capitalist class or the ruling class that wants to move from, all this stuff in Europe and the Middle East to we're going to dominate the Western hemisphere. So say, everything north of the US and south of the US, we're going to focus on dominating those states.
Consolidate its dominance in the Western hemisphere and increase its role and its military in the Pacific, the American Lake, you see. Because it's China that's the real threat to the U.S. economically and militarily, long run. And the smarter capitalists know that. They've been saying for over a decade, we've got to switch our resources, and they're pissing away resources and a war in Ukraine and now a war in the Middle East that is not as strategic to the U.S. as the new threats, you see. So the restructuring has an economic element for how to fund the empire, right? And it's trying to shift to shore up the Western Hemisphere. Why all this talk about Greenland? Oh, because Russia's Arctic strategy is far advanced compared to the U.S. Russia has some 50 icebreakers. The U.S. has two, right? The U.S. has Alaska, but it does not have Greenland or the Canadian North in between. That's what all this pressure on Carney and the Canadians is about, to get them to spend more on the far northern Arctic, part of a new American strategy of checking the Russians in the Arctic. We need Canada to spend more. They've said they're going to, by the way, so that's an indicator they know what's going on. All this talk about 51 states is just, putting pressure on Canada. And Greenland's over on the other side, right? Greenland is also strategic because with the melting of the Arctic, now you're going to have transport passage year round through the Arctic, China and Russia coming down the west coast of Greenland, right? So, and then of course, Greenland has all these resources, massive resources, or rare earth and so forth. So the U.S. wants Greenland. It's wanted Greenland since World War II. It made a proposal to buy Greenland in World War II, and I think even before that. So this is not new, taking Greenland, and he's going to get Greenland, I think, one way or another. The same thing about the Panama Canal. What's been happening in recent years in the Panama Canal is that the Chinese have been buying up resources and strengthening their position in the ports and in the canal. The U.S. has got worried, is putting pressure on the Panamanian government, kick the Chinese out, right? And we're sending BlackRock in to buy up the ports. So that's strategic. You don't want to let the Chinese shipping, I'm not talking about military, but just shipping, get into the Atlantic. You want to cut them off.
I just had two more questions. I wanted to come back. You mentioned your criticisms of Trump's foreign policy. What about on the domestic front?
Well, on the domestic front, it's an fiscal policy is a continuation of neoliberal policy. My 2020 book, The Scourge of Neoliberalism, U.S. Economic Policy will bring into Trump, right? One of the hallmarks of neoliberal policy is to increase war and defense spending, cut taxes on the rich, cut spending on the middle class and the poor, right? And try to control the budget deficits to some extent, right? But what's happened since 2001, the neocons who want to just continue military action and continue things as they are, and whenever they fail, which they've done repeated times, they just double down. As others have said, they have no reverse gear. It's just go faster, more wars and so forth. They've been running U.S. policy since 2001, maybe even since 99. And the Trump fiscal policy is just a continuation of this neoliberal policy. Raise defense, right? Cut business taxes, cut social spending. Okay, social spending doesn't make up for the business tax cuts, so the defense spending increases. So you get the deficits. Try to control the deficits to some extent as best you can. No one knows when that breaks, right? But it's getting worse, right? The debt is getting worse. So it's a continuation of fiscal policy. Monetary policy is another neoliberal policy. Neoliberal monetary policy is to keep interest rates low. Well, the Federal Reserve Bank has been raising rates, right? There's going to be a fight between Trump and the present central bank to lower interest rates. Industrial policy, what is that? That's privatize, deregulate, keep wages low, keep unions at bay. All of that is part of industrial policy. And then you got trade policy, which is sanctions and trade deficits and so forth. So it's a continuation. You see, he needs to change neoliberal policies, but he can't, because neoliberal policies are what's keeping the empire going. You see.
Why do you think, just out of curiosity, why do you think, I always hear people say, well, Trump is taking us out of the neoliberal era. Why do you think people think that, and why do you think they're mistaken?
Well, because, first, fiscal policy, no. Monetary policy, no. Industrial policy, no. Privatization, deregulation, continuing, right? So all that leaves is what's called external policy, trade, right? Trade and money capital flows and currency, the dollar and its role in the empire as the linchpin of the empire, right? Economic empire. Well, this talk about tariffs, you see, and increasing tariffs appears as if it is contrary to neoliberal policies. But you got to understand why all this talk about increasing tariffs. Well, that's different from neoliberal of the past because it's an attempt to raise revenues to help offset the budget deficit. You say he's planning to increase revenues. That's the number one goal, I think, of the tariffs and the trade deficit. So it appears as if, this is not neoliberal. But if you look at it, really it is. Now, when he was running for election, he was talking about changing neoliberalism in a couple of these elements. But now in the reality, right, he's falling back to traditional neoliberal policies, which, by the way, historically served to restore the American empire in the 80s after the crisis of the 70s. Neoliberalism worked. It worked very well. It enabled the U.S. empire to expand in the 80s and the 90s, right? But after 2000, it has been generating internal contradictions, which I'll talk about in my book. Fiscal policy is not working. It's not as efficient. Monetary policy is not as efficient, right? Trade policy was always questionable. So neoliberal policies, which are the economic policies supporting the empire, are running into contradictions. They're not as efficient, they're not as effective. And we can see the empire becoming fiscally unstable as a result of these neoliberal policies breaking down. Now, he's not changing them. He's continuing them, particularly fiscal and monetary policy, which why I say in my book, he started out maybe in ideas to restructure neoliberalism in the empire, but he's failing. And he's going to fail miserably, I think, over the next 2 years.
Last thing, just briefly, and I don't even know if you have an opinion on it or if you think it's a distraction, but what do you make of all this talk around the New York mayoral primaries and Zohran Mamdani?
Yeah, well, it's a reflection of the total crisis within the Democratic Party, right? Their traditional candidates, Cuomo and others, right, can't win anymore with their traditional programs. Those programs have been bankrupt, and no one wants to support them. Or increasingly, working class folks don't want to support them, right? The Democrats aren't offering any alternative. So here comes this guy, the social democrat, right, who says he's going to do certain things which are totally out of the context of the Democratic DNC leadership program context, right? He's proposing new things, right? But what you're going to see, I think, is the DNC, the corporate money bags in the party, are going to try to defeat him. Right? They're going to try or co-opt him if they can't defeat him, turn him into a traditional left Democrat, just as they done with AOC and the others, or preferably to defeat him. They'll run probably a third candidate here if they can't get him to agree between now and the election to do what they want him to do. You see, they'll try to co-opt him first. But if they can't, then they'll run someone against them. Or maybe they'll just lose the election and then join the Republicans to undermine him, right? And to discredit him and his programs and so forth going forward, because they don't want that to catch fire, that kind of a campaign in other big cities. They don't want that to happen. They'll either co-opt him or they will undermine him in the election or after the election. That's the way I see this.
Well, I want to thank you again, Dr. Jack Rasmus, for coming on Parallax Views, and you'll have to keep me posted about the Twilight of American Imperialism book when it comes out. We'll have you back on to discuss it in depth.
Okay, my pleasure. We're glad to do so.
This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Kilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, WV, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Darko, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mark M, Merisham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. If nothing else, if we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.